Colleagues, welcome back after the coffee break. And I'm really very much pleased to introduce our second speaker today, who is Andrey Illarionov. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity in Washington, D.C. From 2000 to December 2005, he was the chief economic advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Dr. Illarionov also served as the President's personal representative in the G8. He is one of Russia's most forceful and articulate advocates for an open society and democratic capitalism. Illarionov received his PhD from St. Petersburg University in 1987. From 1993 to 1994, he served as chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Viktor Chernomyrdin. He resigned in February to protest changes in the government's economic policy. Illarionov has co-authored several economic programs for Russian governments and has written 3 books and more than 300 articles on Russian economic and social policies. Dr. Illarionov, we are very pleased to have you with us to discuss the political and economic situation in Ukraine and its relationship with Russia and the West. Thank you for joining us here, and we look forward very much to your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is a high honor, a special pleasure for me to be here, and I have a chance to share with you some comments and ideas concerning the current state of affairs in Ukraine, Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, and some other places. Even the title of the talk is about Ukraine and Russia. I think it would be rather hard for me to avoid touching some other areas that related to the development over the last several months. Over the last several months, many people around the world keep asking what is going on. What does it mean, this Mr. Putin's attack on Ukraine, occupation and annexation of Crimea, Russian regime's interference in eastern Ukraine? What are Putin's real and long-term targets? Where and when is he going to stop, if any? So I have prepared 10 main points that I'd like to share with you. It would be very brief. It's a very telegraphic style, but I would be happy to try to answer your questions. The first point is there is a lot of statement that is a Ukrainian crisis or crisis in Ukraine. It is neither crisis in Ukraine nor Ukrainian crisis. This is not internal affair of Ukraine. This is a war. This is a Russian-Ukrainian war. To be correct, it is Mr. Putin's war against Ukraine. And this war is only introductory chapter of much larger event which can be called war, and actually it's already been called war. It's been called World War, and it's been called Fourth World War. I'll try to elaborate this later, but that's not my choice of this particular term. That's a term that is being used by Kremlin propaganda machine, that this is a Fourth World War against the rest of the world that is being waged right now by the Russian regime. Second point, I'd like also to attract your attention that in some analytical work we can find a description of this war as a Cold War, either restoration of the some kind of old Cold War or starting a new Cold War. To my mind, it is neither a continuation of the Cold War that ended at the brink of the 1980s and 1990s with settlement in Europe. And this is not a new Cold War. I would like to attract your attention to the fact that during Cold War, that Cold War after the Second World War, sometimes it's been called Third World War, During the Cold War, there was no occupation and annexation of any part of any European country. That happened right now. There were attempts to change regimes, political regimes in some countries, but the borders between free world and non-free world in Europe did not change. Also, another very substantial difference between the current situation and the Cold War, that time there was no personal sanctions. There were some other sanctions, but not personal sanctions. So that's not a Cold War. What would be the right title of this new war remains to be seen. Certainly, it's a work for analysts and politicians. Nevertheless, it's not a Cold War. Once again, I remind you that Kremlin propaganda machine has already called it as a fourth world war. Third, for many people, this war happened to be a kind of wake-up call. Some people say that for the first time, some kind of Russian troops to move to another country, or a few months ago, everything was okay, and we had a wonderful relations with Russia and so on and so on, and all of a sudden, everything has changed. Let me remind you that not only a few months ago, but a few years ago, namely 6 years ago, there was a Russian-Georgian war. There was a Russian aggression against independent Georgia that led to intervention into Georgia of Russian troops and occupation of 2 Georgian provinces that now it's about 20% of the Georgian territory. Some technologies of that war, Russian-Georgian war, have been repeated now in Ukraine. Some have been updated and developed. Unfortunately, lessons of the Russian-Georgian war have not been learned, have not been very well studied, have not been learned, and the conclusions have not been made. It was a very wide kind of shared desire to blame for what happened 6 years ago on President of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, for the so-called mistakes, and just desire to forget what happened. But today, or 3 months ago, in Ukraine, there was no Ukrainian Mikhail Saakashvili. There was a Viktor Yanukovych over there, one of the most pro-Russian and pro-Putin's president in the whole post-Soviet space. And the Russian troops started military operation for occupation and annexation of Crimea on February 20th, as the Russian Minister of Defense has announced recently, which was 2 days before Mr. Yanukovych has signed agreement with 3 opposition leaders and with 3 foreign ministers from Europe, and 4 days before Mr. Yanukovych ran from the territory of Ukraine on the board of the Russian Navy ship. So that aggression happened not as a result of Maidan revolution, not as a result of overthrow of Mr. Yanukovych. It was started when Yanukovych was a full-fledged legitimate president of Ukraine. So that is why it doesn't matter whether Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia or Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine or whoever in any other place in any country that is being considered as a part of the spheres of imperial interests, it can be, that country can be target of the aggression. Fourth, moreover, 20 plus years ago, there was not only Russian-Georgian, there were wars in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. And if someone can be thankful for the Crimean operation and for operations in eastern Ukraine that is performed by Russian Spetsnaz and commanders and so-called volunteers and Chechens and Dagestani and Ossetians and so on, it would be for open, public, worldwide demonstrations of the methods undertaken in all those cases, meaning Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Russian-Georgian war, Russian-Ukrainian war. So the previous case of these similar operations with little green men was the occupation and annexation not even of these post-Soviet countries, but of 3 Baltic states in 1940. And I would like to attract your attention to the little booklet that has been distributed for the delegates of this assembly, Lessons of History, the Silent Occupation of 1940, that actually showed that some methods, basic methods that have been undertaken right now in Ukraine, 6 years ago in Georgia, 20 plus years in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, for the first time have been tried in Baltic countries in the 1940s. And thank you, our Lithuanian host, for preparing this booklet, which very important to understand this historical connection between those events. And frankly speaking, it's even can be these traces can be these methods can be traced even earlier to the so-called October Revolution in Russia. The methods of military coup with establishing of the terrorist regime, with the killing, torturing, murdering political opponents, with falsifying elections and referendums, and establishing a new either authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, either in Russia or in Cuba or in North Korea or in some other places. My fifth point concerning Ukraine. Certainly it's a huge topic to discuss right now, but I'd like to mention probably the most important process that is underway in Ukraine over the last 20 plus years since receiving its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This process of the gradual but very fast westernization, political westernization of the country. Sometimes it also has a shape of Ukrainization, but essentially it is a spread of Western type of institutions and type of behavior for more and more territories of Ukraine, for more and more people in Ukraine. In the election of 1991, the Western orientation, the Western values, pro-Western politicians got support of only 3 out of 25 Ukrainian oblasts. The frontier between the Western orientation and so-called, I would not say pro-Russian, I would say pro-Soviet orientation, along those 20 years was moving fast from northwest of Ukraine to southeast. For some period of time, there was an impression, incorrect one, that the process stalled with roughly half of the country regularly voting for the so-called Orange Coalition, pro-Western forces, and another half for the so-called Blue and White Coalition, or so-called pro-Soviet forces in Ukraine. In reality, the process continued and intensified very much, especially under Presidents Yushchenko and Yanukovych. By summer year 2013, pro-Western, pro-European forces in Ukraine were winning with a very solid gap over pro-Soviet, pro-so-called Eurasian forces. Having understood that Ukraine is leaving the pro-Soviet, pro-Eastern, pro-Eurasian sphere of imperial influence, Mr. Putin has launched this last anti-Ukrainian war. My next point is about this Russian-Ukrainian war, which especially I'd like to talk a little bit about the ideological basis for this war. This war is not an accident. It is not something that happened all of a sudden and Mr. Putin was forced, some kind of dragged into Ukraine, as some people claim, or some kind of was forced to take Crimea. It's a quotation. This war was carefully planned and prepared for many years. And there are several milestones on this way I would like to mention. First of all, for the corporation of KGB/FSB officers that was ascending to power in Russia in the 1990s and got this power, I would say absolute power, in the year 2000s, Ukraine was never considered to be an independent state. On March 25th, 1999, Vyacheslav Chernovil, dissident and human rights defender in Soviet times, the leader of the People's Ruch movement and a candidate in the 1999 presidential election in Ukraine, has been assassinated in the carefully organized car accident on the road Boryspil-Zolotonosha. The investigation by SBU, Security Service of Ukraine, established that several groups of FSB officers had been sent to Ukraine prior to this accident to fulfill their job. The beginning of massive preparation to the whole-fledged aggression against Ukraine can be detected as early as in summer year 2003, when Mr. Putin has admitted completely, it's quotation, completely unacceptable fact that the cradle of the Russian state, the mother Russian cities, Kiev, also site of the ancient big Kiev-Pechorskaya Lavra, lies beyond boundaries of the modern Russian Federation. Later, the legend, falsified, of baptism of the great prince Vladimir Sviatoslavovich in the Greek city of Chersones, now this is the city limits of Sevastopol, has been brought to the attention of Mr. Putin. Therefore, according to this approach, the only two truly holy places of the Eastern Orthodox Church that most of the Russian population belongs to, namely Kiev and Chersones or Korsun in Russian or Sevastopol, happen to be on the territory of Ukraine, not in Russia. That was considered unacceptable, and it was a plan that was elaborated to bring those places, at least those two places, under the Russian control. You know that on September 5th, 2004, another presidential candidate in the Ukrainian election, Viktor Yushchenko, has been poisoned by dioxin and barely survived. The radical addition to methods of propaganda war, massive corruption of the Ukrainian officialdom, and Russian subversive actions in Ukraine in the form of the possible military solution of the Ukrainian question was made in the late autumn of year 2004 after refusal of the then Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma at the airport Vnukovo II meeting on December 2nd, year 2004 with Vladimir Putin to use force, including Russian troops, against demonstrators during the Orange Revolution, and after the final victory of Viktor Yushchenko in the third round of the presidential election of December 26, year 2004. One of the versions of the military campaign against Ukraine with the possible use of the nuclear strike against Ukrainian troops near Kiev has been openly published on April 21st, year 2008 in the newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta under the title The Mechanical Orange. In April year 2008. Same month, on April 4th, year 2008, during the NATO summit in Bucharest, Vladimir Putin told to George Bush Jr. that Ukraine is not a real state, while probably half of the territory of Ukraine is historically Russian one and should actually belong to Russia and should be brought to Russia. In over the last 5 years, the concept of the so-called Russian world has been developed. According to this concept, there is no such ethnic group like Ukrainians and Belarusians, and Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are the same, some kind of groups of one Russian people, and they should be brought under the same government roof. There are many facts that over the last 5 or so years can be demonstrated in this. But the official announcement of this ideological concept has happened on July 27, year 2013, in Kiev, during the official ceremony of the 1025th anniversary of the baptism of Rus. Quotation of Mr. Putin: "The civilization choice has been made not only for Ukraine, but for the whole Holy Russia. It makes us a united nation." In that speech, Putin, for the first time, has switched from using with the name Ukraine, preposition in, that in the Russian language is used with the state, not territory, that Mr. Putin used before that regularly, to preposition on, that in the Russian language is used with territory, not state. So instead of saying in Ukraine, he started to take on Ukraine with a very clear non-recognition of independent and sovereign state of this country. 2 days later, on July 29th, year 2013, with the attack of the Russia's chief sanitary doctor Omnishenko on Rosshem chocolate candy, the Russian government began sanitary, trade, economy war against Ukraine. Later, in November year 2013, it has been expanded into a diplomatic campaign that forced Mr. Yanukovych to reject signing the Ukraine-EU association agreement. Military campaign, as I mentioned already, has been studied by Russian Ministry of Defense on February 20th. That is being commemorated in the medal that has been coined by the ministry for return of Crimea from February 20th to March 18th. It is also important to mention here that the ships, the military transportation ships with troops left their ports 7 or 10 days before the launch of this military operation. But this new ideological concept has been developed further during Mr. Putin's press conference on April 17th, 2014. Then, for the first time in the history of Russia, and this is an absolutely historic event, historic term, Mr. Putin spoke about, quotation, the powerful genetic code of the Russian nation that makes us, Russians, different from and superior over other nations, and especially compared to the so-called Western genetic code. One of the most important features of the Russian genetic code, according to Mr. Putin, is ability, quotation, to die for the common cause publicly in front of eyes of the community. This is at least second time when Mr. Putin publicly spoke about the Russian genetic code and called for sacrifice of his compatriots. The previous one was on February 23rd, 2012, the day of the Soviet Army and Navy, during his rally for the third term of his presidency. Then Putin cited Russian poet Mikhail Lermontov and called to die, again quotation, to die for Moscow and win. After the press conference of April 17, 2014, the Russian official propaganda took a new level of virulent heat, with key propaganda persons explaining to the public what does it mean. One of them, Mr. Mamontov, whose office, as Russian press claims, is located inside the FSB building in Lubyanka, on April 29th, has explained that the unfolding war will be the world war, quotation, the Russia's war against the rest of the world. Sergei Kurginyan, another veteran of the propaganda wars, since his work for the KGB head Kryuchkov, leader of the August 91 coup, has clarified the new war will be not a third one. He correctly mentioned that the third one was a cold one that ended in early 1990s, but the fourth World War. Another veteran of propaganda was Sergei Markov on May 14th, 2014, has explained in the Moscow Times article that the purpose of this new Putin's war against the Western alliance is to break it into two parts, into hostile Anglo-Saxon world that should be destroyed and friendly continental Europe. As it appears right now, the current campaign launched by Mr. Putin has three basic levels and three targets. First, on Ukraine. Ukraine either should be under Mr. Putin's control or it should be destroyed as independent and sovereign state. Second level, creation of the so-called Russian world. Under the roof of the Russian state and the so-called Russian world should be united the largest divided nation of the world, Russians. This is a quotation. That's exactly the quotation that has been used by Nazi propaganda in late 1930s, just in the preparation of the Second World War, and by Slobodan Milosevic in his attempt to so-called create a great Serbia. That this group of the categories that should be included into this Russian world are four. First, ethnic Russians, regardless where they live. Second, Russian-speaking people, regardless of their ethnicity. Third, compatriots and their offspring who ever lived on the territory of the USSR. Fourth, compatriots and their offspring who ever lived on the territory of the Russian Empire. Moreover, that's not only a concept written by strange kind of propaganda people. This is a law. This is a law that has been adopted by the Russian State Duma a couple of years ago that creates a legal basis for operations outside Russian borders. Moreover, another law has been adopted that gives legal right to use Russian military troops in other countries beyond the Russian borders to defend compatriots that belongs to the Russian world. The third level of this war is the Western alliance. The Western alliance should be broken into camps, these Anglo-Saxon worlds, but according to these propaganda people, and this kind of the general staff or whoever, Kremlin, includes US, UK, and the so-called front states, this kind of the term that has been borrowed from the war against apartheid in South Africa. To the front states belongs Poland and 3 Baltic states. and this camp should be destroyed. And the continental Europe that is made should be either neutral to new Putin's Russia or could even become a Russian ally. I don't have much time, but I just very briefly, last 3 points. This is a new war by many regards, and especially by so-called new type of warfare that is being used, or old type of new warfare that has been developed to new levels. The several terms have been used right now, like hybrid war or a new, unusual, non-conventional type of war. What is special that all the new technologies are being used simultaneously, and they combining the hard and soft power. I would mention some of them in which, as we can see, aggressor has achieved some level of, let's say, excellence. Intelligence, counterintelligence, and on the other hand, some kind of the very serious mistakes and failures on the intelligence on the other side, including from the NATO. Information, disinformation, and propaganda war, which now is going to be one of the most powerful instruments. Cyber war, a wide use of special forces, commanders of different types. Wide use of the so-called non-governmental actors, including NGOs, religious organizations, private persons, and so on, that are acting relatively independently, but under the overall guidance and centralized command. Wide use of subversive actions, new terrorist tactics using women and children as human shields in attacks on military objects and civil objects as well. Energy warfare, and you have a special session about this. Economic warfare, including trade, sanitary, financial, and other instruments. Corruption that brought to another level the almost full buyout of the political and military leaderships of the targeted countries, and Ukraine happened to be one of the very clear examples. The fifth column in Ukraine, in other post-Soviet states, and in the West, including Europe. The so-called Putin term, the Putin International, some kind of new combination or organization of different political parties and politicians that are openly being supported by Mr. Putin and themselves supporting Mr. Putin. One of the most important observations of these wars is there is no more clearly defined, visible, geographical, political, or military borders. So borders can be everywhere, within each country. So this is probably one of the special characteristics of this new Fourth World War. How to react to this? I think it's really time to create, to elaborate, to develop the counter strategy. Without such a strategy, it's impossible to achieve anything. First of all, it is necessary to understand this is a war. This is not a joke. This is not an accident. It's not a mistake. It's not a bad dream. It will not go out by itself. This is a war. And is any war, you either win or lose. And up to you, to your choice, what you would like to choose. Second, to understand the essence of the beast, which is aggressive Putin's regime. And it was aggressive internally within the country against the Chechens movement, against the democratic opposition, against whoever, and outside, against Georgia, against Ukraine, against Baltic countries and others. Unfortunately, this regime became much more powerful recently with these victories in Ukraine because it received substantial and very substantial support of the substantial portion of the Russian population. So right now we're dealing not only with the regime, but with, not full, but with substantial portion of the Russian society that became revisionists and revanchists. And we need to understand it. Third, to understand necessity of preparation of the medium to long-term strategy, like 14 points of Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, or Atlantic Charter in the Second World War, or Mr. Churchill Fulton speech, or whatever, just to understand the problem, to understand long-term targets, and main instruments to achieve those targets. Fourth, to understand mistakes that have been already made. I will not mention them, but if there will be questions, I will talk about this. Fifth, to come to understanding and agreement on the medium and long-term targets of the strategy, this counter-strategy. And sixth, to start to implement this strategy, constantly correcting the course. On my part, a group of people have prepared the draft of the document for consideration of the appropriate authorities of the NATO countries, and it is now under necessary analysis, scrutiny, and work. And I think it's a first step, but certainly it's not the last one, and I would invite everybody to work on this document and similar documents. It's impossible to discuss all these documents right now, but I would like to mention at least the crucial elements of the counter-strategy. First, purely military area, it's quite clear that victory in this war cannot be achieved without developing a new military doctrine in this counter-strategy. In this so-called hybrid war, the traditional or conventional methods do not work fully, as we have seen it. So that is why soft power is wonderful, but itself, it does not deter use of force. Second, which became really one of the most important instruments in this attack, information, disinformation, and propaganda war. We see that one country by another can fall victims of this propaganda war. The first victim is Russian population, some part of the Ukrainian population, some part of populations of other countries, and including countries of Western Europe as well. This is a very delicate issue because there is no available ready instruments that would work with defense of the most cherished freedom of information, freedom of speech. We need to develop something that would preserve this freedom, nevertheless would not allow propaganda, and this is a very dangerous instrument. In the area of international law, it is absolutely crucial to develop a new definition of aggression. We have a definition of aggression that has been adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1974. Now, with new instruments, and clearly, this definition should be updated. In 1939, when aggressor attacked Finland, the Soviet Union, the League of Nations discussed this issue, and within 2 weeks has taken a decision of expulsion of the aggressor from the membership of the League of Nations. We can see what is the distance today, 75 years later. So aggressor has already made 2 absolute clear attacks on independent countries, but nothing similar has happened. We need to think what should be done about aggressor in new environment. As a result of this implementation of strategy should be some kind of Helsinki II Act with confirmation of borders in Europe that must be signed by all participants, including by the Russian administration, either current one or new one. Politics. There is a theory of democratic peace. Democracies do not fight each other, and probably we do not have example that democracy did fight each other. So that is why to solve the problem strategically is the only way to make Russia a democratic state, regardless how long it would take. This is a real solution to this crisis and to this war. It is something similar to the problem of Germany in the Second World War. This is a very special part of strategy, but nobody should be assured that new war will not be started even more prepared, better prepared, with more casualties and more bloodshed, unless Russia will become sooner or later a democratic state. Only then we can say that we achieved more or less stable world, reasonably lasting peace, Europe free, whole, democratic, and with peace among all countries and neighbors. Thank you.